Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce Christos Maravelias from Princeton, who's been doing a lot of this large-scale analysis of the chemical conversion pathways for using our biomaterials, like nationally and ultimately, I guess, globally. So yeah, welcome, Christos.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the invitation to present our work in this series. So yes, my presentation is about really bioenergy and how we model bioenergy systems to better understand the trade-offs and the major drivers. So in terms of motivation, maybe I don't have to motivate it too much. I'm sure you have all seen some figure like this that shows increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and which has many consequences, including what is happening in the West Coast these days. And this challenge has been recognized by many people working in many different areas. And here I'm listing some of the technologies that are being studied. For example, we are rethinking maybe some old technologies, but also we are trying to develop new ones. But I would argue that despite of all the fundamental research in these areas, there are still many open questions to be addressed. And here I list some of them with particular emphasis on the ones that we're interested in. So, for example, if we assume, and I think it's a valid assumption, that liquid fuels will be needed for the next decades, even if there is significant electrification and because of aviation and heavy vehicles, then there are some questions. For example, are we better off trying to develop biofuels or use solar energy to develop liquid fuels? And then if we, let's say that we want to do biofuels, what's the best way to produce biofuels? There are many different platforms and so on and so forth, right? So really the main thesis of my talk today is that process systems engineering, or thinking about the system, can help us think about some of these questions. Not necessarily give definite answers, as I will show later. Sometimes the answers are very case specific, but can help us generate frameworks to address this type of questions. Now, while we are trying to address these questions, sometimes we also have to develop new methods, and that's what makes research fun. But I won't be discussing too much about the method developing. I will be focusing on how we use these methods to address questions. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll start with a little bit of some preliminaries about process synthesis. I will explain what is process synthesis. And then I will focus on two broad areas: how we can think and design systems. And when I say systems here, I mean like a biorefinery that does carbon capture. And then how would we think about large-scale systems that include multiple biorefineries and they are at a regional scale. And then I'll close with an example about this large-scale system. So I'm a chemical engineer. Chemical engineers do many different things, but I would say one of the major tasks of chemical engineering is to come up with ways to take a chemistry that has been shown in the lab and make a system, a plant, we call it process or a chemical plant, that would implement that chemistry at a very large scale. So how do we develop these systems? Well, we tend to think about these systems in three different steps. The first step is, how do we do the conversions? There are many different reactors. We can run them in many different pressures, in many different temperatures. So how do we do these conversions, these chemical conversions? That's part one. These conversions are never complete, almost never complete. In other words, we will have some raw materials that they won't be converted into final products. We don't want to waste them. We don't want to just vent them in the atmosphere. We will have to find a way to recycle them back to the reactor. And also the final product will almost never meet the specifications. The final product will not be pure enough to meet the market specification. So around the reactors, we want to build what we call the separations. And I'm not going to go through the details of this figure, so I'm just going to convey the major ideas. So we have to find ways to get what is unreacted and is raw material, send it back, so we don't have to buy more. and also we have to somehow meet these specifications. Okay, that's the separation. And then around that system here, we have to think, how do we provide heat? How do we provide electricity when we are pumping things? How do we cool things? Because some of these reactions take place in very high temperatures. So we have to think about the energy optimization. So this is one way to think about this problem. The disadvantage is that we are optimizing subsystems sequentially, and this can lead to very bad decisions, very bad designs, suboptimal designs. So the alternative, and what we are using in the group, is what we call a superstructure optimization. So in what I'm showing here is a network, but not every part, every node of this network is going to be part of the optimal design. This can also be viewed as a network design for those of you who have a more a CS type of background or operations research type of background. It's just that the nodes are a little bit more complicated, right? The reaction is happening, some physical phenomena are happening in every node. So we start with this big network that we postulate, we develop a model. The model then, if we can solve it, will give us the optimal design. So here I have grayed out the parts of the network that are not selected. The parts that are selected have to satisfy the physical laws. Okay, so this is very good, right? It's too good to be true. And yes, this approach has many challenges. The primary one being, can we formulate this model? And if we can formulate it, can we solve it to get this solution? So this is where, when I'm talking about methods development, that's where a lot of research goes into. For now, I'm going to assume that this is the case. We can solve this problem, we can get a solution. Okay? Last part about the kind of a little bit the preliminaries about the tools that we are using. So the goal, and we have a lot of these projects are in collaboration with experimental groups that develop this type of technologies. So our goal when we are applying these methods is to really get back to our experimental collaborators and give them some feedback. The feedback could be, oh, that's the area where further advances are necessary. Because right now, this renewable technology does not look promising. But if we focus on this area, we will reduce the cost by 30%. So this is the type of feedback that we would like to provide. And in a way, this can be done by simulation. So this is my one slide attempt to kind of differentiate simulation versus optimization and how we use optimization in this setting. So one could think simulation, and apologies for those of you who are working on very kind of advanced simulation methods for dynamic systems. Right now here I'm thinking about steady state systems, right? So there is not a time evolution in time, but still we have simulation. I would argue that at very high level, simulation can be viewed as the process where we have a model of our system, some input, and then we provide the design. This can be applied to economics, can be applied to chemical engineering, can be applied to many, many different disciplines. And the simulation will give us an answer, okay? So mathematically, one could say that simulation is a function y equals f of x comma theta. Theta is the design, x is the input, f is the model that we chose, right, to use for our simulation, and the simulation will give us an output, okay? Optimization is the same thing, it's just that theta is unknown. So in a way, we are trying to find the design, theta, that will optimize a function of the output y. Right? So it's not, we have degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom are the design. And one way to think about it is that instead of explicitly solving y equals f of x of comma theta, we are solving a system of equations where the design is embedded. Okay? And we have an objective function. Okay. So that's really what I said, this bullet point. So we would like to use optimization. We want to find the design of a system that would optimize, let's say, environmental metric. So let me go now to the
So actually, I have a question here in terms of relationship between your stuff and simulations. it sounds like instead of using simulations like there's a lot of the chemical like Aspen and many others,
Yes.
you're replacing them with a set of explicit equations and optimizing that constraint system for your family of equations,
Yes.
but not using simulations explicitly.
Exactly. So we try to rewrite the equations that Aspen would write in the background. We don't see them, but that's what they do, and try to find the design to optimize something. Exactly.
Okay.
There is a trade-off. There is a trade-off when we do that. That Aspen can be very, very detailed. We make some approximations. So that's the trade-off.
Okay, got it.
I'll be happy to discuss more.
Right. And so my question then would be, if you want the accuracy of Aspen with something like a neural approximation, which is a set of constraints with a gradient, be compatible with your approach, because you can optimize those things reasonably easily.
Yeah, sure. So very, very, very good question. So the way we approach this, and I would say the methods that I will be discussing today, is what we call a preliminary design, or what we call a process synthesis, where we really, the network that I showed in the previous slide has many, many embedded configurations. So here it's a toy example that has maybe 5 configurations, but they can be 100. So we would like to solve an optimization problem where we are considering many different alternatives, kind of narrow down the ones that are promising, and then for the ones that are promising, do a more detailed simulation using Aspen.
Got it. That helps.
Okay, so let me start with the first system, which is carbon capture and storage. It has been, it's widely studied system, but I would argue that most of the studies consider one configuration. And let me explain what I mean by one configuration. In this very busy slide, the gray flows here is the flow of carbon in a biorefinery that starts with what we call bioenergy crop. Not corn. And starting from this amount, 3.14 tons of feedstock, we finally get one, so it's normalized with respect to ethanol. So there is a lot of carbon really that then does not end up in the fuel. The microbial conversion biorefinery that I'm showing here leads to the generation of 3 different streams containing CO2. The first one comes out of the fermentation. Then another one comes out when we are burning some residual streams to generate heat. And then another stream comes from wastewater treatment. That should be in every biorefinery. So there is not a single carbon sequestration system combined with bioenergy, with ethanol. There is one where we are capturing carbon from the easiest stream. That would be the one that is emitted from fermentation. It's almost pure CO2. So if we capture only this part, then we are going to, so here is what is emitted if we do no capture. Out of the 3.14, 1.96 is going to end up in the atmosphere. If we do the easy capture, that is only from fermentation, what is going to happen? 1.44 would still be emitted in the atmosphere, but we will sequester 0.5. Then we pick the next easiest stream to capture. That would be the flow shown in green. And then if we do all the possible capture, this would be the flows in blue. We would do significant amount of capturing, but still we would emit something in the atmosphere. So one question is, what is the appropriate amount of sequestration? As we do more, sequestering becomes more expensive. Also, we start having energetic demands. So that was really the question that we're trying to address in this first approach. And what I'm showing here, I want to go through the details again, is the underlying superstructure, the underlying network in a biorefinery. It has all these different options for pretreatment, hydrolysis, and what I'm showing in the blue dotted dust box is the part that we're going to be changing. So if we do no capture, these are going to be the units that are going to be in the design. If we start doing capture, more units will be necessary. Having more units means that we have more cost, and the energy required to do this capture would increase. So at the end, we have these 5 options to do capture in a biorefinery: B, C, D, E, and F. Okay. There is an aspect about transportation, how far we should go to get a biomass, unlike, let's say, an oil refinery, and I would say the majority of manufacturing systems, where we want to have economies of scale, but refineries are a little bit different. The trade-off here is that from a capital investment standpoint, of course, we would like to have bigger systems, right? Because then the cost per gallon of ethanol of the capital will decrease, right? Because of economies of scale. The trade-off, though, is that as these biorefineries are becoming larger, the biomass will have to come from farther away. So the average transportation distance will increase, right? So it's not clear what is the optimal size of a biorefinery. There is this trade-off, which depends on the transportation mode. Do we use trucks? Do we use train? And then do we use depots? For this analysis that I'm going to show here, and I'm going to then show how we relax these assumptions, we do some approximations, and this is kind of the feedstock cost, how it increases with biorefinery capacity. This graph has a lot of information. The color here shows the transportation mode, so that would be directly from the field using truck. Then if we are a little bit farther away from the biorefinery, we would like to use still truck, but we would send it through a depot. That's an intermediate facility that does some densification. And then if the biorefinery capacity is even larger, that would mean that we would have to bring biomass from farther away. Then the transportation mode would be a little bit different. So this is what we do. And then this is on this side, we are also showing the maximum collection radius. Okay, so that was the approximation that we used, and these are the results. So every point in this graph, it's a heat map, is the result of an optimization. And for this optimization, we fix the sequestration credit that we obtain and the capacity of the biorefinery. So let's see what this graph shows. It says that at very low sequestration credits, let's say where the laser pointer is, it doesn't make sense to do capture. Financial sense. We go with option A. Option A, if you remember in that slide that I was showing all the different configurations, is the option where we do no capture. And it makes sense, right? If our objective function is maximize revenue or minimize cost, then we wouldn't want to do capture, which adds cost for the same amount of ethanol, unless the incentive is significant. But if we stay, let's say, with a low capacity refinery and we'll move along the x-axis, at some point, we are going to start doing capture, but only from the easy stream, let's say, the one that is almost 90% CO2. And as the credit increases, we see that we will start doing more capture. But because the cost initially decreases with capacity, this, let's say, threshold, this front, will move at lower credit. So we will be doing some capture earlier if the facility is larger. So this is what this graph shows, right? It has these different regions. In each region, there is a different technology being implemented. And these thick lines, black lines, is the optimal capacity for a given technology. And you will see that this increases. One of the reasons is that carbon capture, actually, it's a quite involved process. We would like to have economies of scale for more and more capture, and that's why the optimal capacity increases. The color shows the ethanol cost. So the way to understand this is that this is the cost at which, or the price at which we should be selling the ethanol to break even. That's another way to think about it. And as we have more and more incentives, the cost at which we break even would decrease. Okay.
So to put this in perspective, what's the break-even price for ethanol to be similar to gasoline, based fuel?
Yeah, so maybe I'll say two important things. For this study, we used all the assumptions that have gone into a national renewable energy lab report. So they're optimistic. I just want to be clear, just to be consistent with that study. So depending on the gasoline price, but because ethanol, 1 gallon of ethanol has less energy than a gallon of gasoline, I would say that is one. So you can think of it that the price should be 3/4 of the price of gasoline to be break even.
Got it. Okay, that helps a lot.
If the a gallon of gasoline sells for $3, let's say, the ethanol would have to be $2.25 to break even, roughly.
Got it. So in this design, it will also be the sequestration credit would have to be higher to make it worthwhile,
Yes,
right?
yes. So here we are not comparing, let's say, this is just a comparison across the alternatives for the biorefinery. If we were, maybe I would say that to be competitive, maybe we have to be here today. Right?
Okay, and then which
fuels price. Sorry?
And then in the study, which biomaterials are you considering?
Yeah, so this one was switchgrass.
Right.
Switchgrass grown in marginal lands. I can give. I'll discuss that a little bit in the next case study. What lands we chose and what crops. The next figure is exactly the same calculations, but instead of reporting the price, we're reporting emissions. So nothing changes within, let's say, each of these designs, but we see that we go from positive to negative emissions as we add sequestration. Okay, so this was great, or we were happy with it, but we really focused only on what we say the microbial conversion of biomass to final products. And when we were publishing this paper, some reviewers said, well, we can do many other things with biomass. So this is really the next part of the study. The extension is asking the same type of questions, but instead of focusing only on this technology or this platform, which would be fermentation, and again, we'd have fermentation and some capturing, more capturing, maximum capturing. Now, part of the technologies that we have to select from is also pyrolysis. Pyrolysis producing hydrogen locally or buying hydrogen, and then gasification. And then gasification can go to electricity or liquid fuels. So now the technologies that we're considering, in a way, here is like of the way that the notation that we're using. This is the platform. These are all gasifications, just for illustration. Then is what we produce, electricity or hydrogen. Then how much sequestration we do. So gas elect-syn, here it means there is a gasification platform. We're producing electricity and we're capturing the CO2 that comes from the syngas generation. Here we're capturing from syngas and flue gas. Okay, so many different options for the technology now. And accounting for carbon gets also a little bit tricky. Since it's and you can find all the information in the paper. How we account for carbon, right? So something that is not always appreciated is that there is a lot of carbon accounting to be made at the field, because if we're using obviously nitrogen for fertilization in general, there are some emissions associated with fertilization. There is harvesting, there is transportation, and this is very difficult CO2 to capture, right? So in the biomass growth and processing, right, we're going to have this transportation, this harvesting, that this CO2 will be emitted. On the flip side, though, and again, this is something that is not accounted very often, is that when biomass grows, it's not only the carbon that is in what we harvest, but there is also soil sequestration. So this is some other part that we really have to take into account when we are designing the system. And in addition, if we have in the biorefinery CO2 capture, we will have additional capturing. And then finally is what happens with the final form of energy. Because it's different if it's electricity, right? If it's electricity, really the way to think about it is what do we replace? And as we will be seeing later, depending on the grid, it might sometimes it might make sense to produce electricity from biomass if we are replacing dirty electricity. But in another location where the grid is already relatively or less dirty, then it would not make sense to make electricity. So again, this is then the other accounting. This is the final result. So in this graph, every color in the bars corresponds to the carbon flow, the color of the carbon flow in this graph. A lot of information to digest. What I would say here, the axis here is greenhouse gas mitigation. So it appears that gasification right now, using the the National Renewable Energy Lab report numbers, gasification seems to be the most promising technology from a mitigation standpoint. Okay. And then the only thing I would say, I don't have the figure here, is that these bars would change in time. The technologies that lead to electricity generation, as the electricity grid changes, the mitigation from these technologies will also change. Okay, so same graph here as before, it's just that now we're not selecting one of 5 configurations for biomass, microbially converted to ethanol. We are selecting from also gasification configurations and pyrolysis configurations, and we see that gasification to electricity or hydrogen is preferred over liquid fuels right now. This might change as electricity becomes more renewable. Okay, so let me now switch gears. So far, the emphasis was on the biorefinery system. We try to model transportation side approximately. We made some assumptions about soil sequestration, but we assume that all of that is the same, regardless of where the biorefinery is established. And what we would like to do now in this project is to give solutions that are location specific. There are many different studies in this area. I have made this presentation for a more academic audience, and so I wanted to make sure that everyone is included. But the challenge with most of these studies is that there are some very crude assumptions about biomass availability. So, and maybe this will bring me to this one. So in most supply chain problems, right, and the biomass supply chain problems that have been considered in the literature, for the most part, we are making some assumptions. For example, that the types of raw materials are the same. So if we are thinking how to design a supply chain, we typically make the assumption that the raw material will always be there. It's going to be the same, right? And probably is going to come from a single point, our vendors or our potential vendors. Many of these assumptions do not hold true when we are thinking about supply chains of renewable energy systems. So the feedstocks can be very different, right? Switchgrass, sorghum, many bioenergy crops could be established. They do not come from a few points, so they are highly distributed geographically. The yield and the quality can vary significantly from year to year because it depends on weather and primarily depends on weather. This is just a map of, for example, availability of different types of what we call marginal lands, but depending on the definition that we have used. So let me pause here and explain the idea of this work, and goes back to Craig's question. So the center that we are part of is focusing on bioenergy crops, not corn, and lands that are not used for food because of the food versus energy debate. These lands that are not currently used for corn or other food crops are, the term that has been used is either marginal lands or bioenergy appropriate lands. Which are these types of lands? Well, there are many, many different definitions. Low capability land, recently abandoned land, and many other definitions. So depending on the definition that we use, we're going to have different available lands, and then on these lands, we could potentially establish very different crops. So that's what leads to this problem being quite different from other supply chain problems, and also very large scale, because now we have to consider individual fields. I would also say, although I'm not going to discuss that today, is that same type of challenges appear also in other renewable energy systems. For example, solar irradiance, highly geographically distributed, same thing with the wind. Okay, so the approach we took here is highly collaborative. We have collaborators, Tyler Lark from University of Wisconsin. He's a geographer, and he's responsible for identifying the lands that would be appropriate. Then Bruno Basso, Michigan State University, is having some models where they will be running these models to predict biomass availability and soil sequestration. Then we come in with the modeling of the biorefinery, and then everything we're going to put together to solve the network design problem. Okay, so I will try to do justice to the work of our collaborators. I'll talk very briefly about bioenergy lands, and then the models that we use for productivity estimation. So these are all the different ways in which we can think about land quality. Of course, it's not very clear. The Venn diagram, there is many overlapping areas in the Venn diagram. And what makes it a little bit more complicated, although I'm not going to be showing results for that, but we are currently working on it. What makes it complicated is that these definitions are expected to change because of climate change. So parts of the country that today we cannot grow certain crops because it's too cold, this is not in Dakotas, for example, this will change over the next 10, 15 years. It has already changed, let's say in Wisconsin or other parts of the country. So parts are becoming warmer, parts are becoming wetter or drier. So this is kind of a moving target. But let's assume for now that it's not a moving target. What we are trying to do, or what our collaborators are trying to do, is identify the lands that are not very high quality, because this would be more appropriate for food, not too low quality, because the yields would be very, very low there. And here, by yield, I mean ton of bioenergy per hectare of land. We would like to identify the ones that are in the middle. They use imaging drones to see to take photos of the land, and then through machine learning try to classify this land. I think I'm going to skip this slide. The end result is this bioenergy atlas. Sorry, before I do that, this is the result of these studies. So this is the map of the United States that includes all historically abandoned lands identified through their methods. This is the same map when the classification is formerly irrigated, and the color says something about the yield. This is the imagery of, if we focus really on these green or blue dots, that's what we will see, the imagery, which is clear that it was formerly irrigated. The result is this atlas, atlas.glbrc.org, where a user can go click certain things. For example, I'm interested in abandoned croplands, and I can even choose when it was abandoned, and it will generate the map. It will identify these lands based on some of these definitions. Okay, so that's land identification. Now, for these lands, our collaborators at MSU run these models, which really try to determine flows of the most important components, nitrogen, water, carbon, in the soil, using as input weather and soil quality. So that's work that is done by Bruno Basso. This is kind of the flows that are handled inside these, what they call them process models. There's a very interesting analogy with chemical engineering, which is, if someone is interested, I'll discuss later. Okay, so this is really what goes into these models. I'm going to skip it, and this is the result. There is now a yield map generated for a given crop. And also because multiple years of weather can be used for these calculations, we don't get a single number. We can also get a distribution of yield at a given land for a given crop. So this is what we will be using in our results that I will be showing soon. We're going to be using switchgrass in these 8 states using these yields. Okay, and something else. Now, in terms of spatial resolution and why it's important to really go at very low granularity. I'll try to illustrate that. So this is a way to kind of generate the harvesting sites for the system that we're considering. And the colors in this map show average yields in these harvesting sites. If these harvesting sites are quite, let's say, they are not coarse, but they are not also very fine. If we zoom a little bit more, we will see that although, let's say, again, I'm focusing on this, I hope you can see my laser, I'm focusing on the harvesting site that is next to the biorefinery that has been established. And this, if we use this resolution, we'll say, okay, this is an okay harvesting site. We will get all its biomass. This is much better. These two are much better, but we need more biomass, so we're going to pick this as well. Now, if we go a little bit in more detail, we will see that each one of these that look very good or bad, actually, that's never the case. There are very few good fields in this area, and ideally, we would like to pick only these fields, not pick the rest, right? Same thing here. So, because the yield and the soil sequestration can be highly variable, the solutions that we would get at an approximate level can be quite different from the solutions that we would get if we consider all the detail. And if we zoom really, really in, that's the picture we're going to see. Okay, that's a preliminary study that we did to understand how the spatially explicit considerations change the solution. It turns out that they change the solution quite a bit. So this is the framework. We are going to have crop simulations to get crop data. Then we collected spatial data from QGIS, did some calculations, approximate calculations taking into account tortuosity of roads, and then finally the information from the biorefinery, that's what I showed in the first part of the talk. All of these went into a large-scale optimization model. This is the solution for Wisconsin. So we would install one refinery in Madison. These smaller icons represent depots where we would collect biomass locally, we would densify, and then we would ship to the biorefinery. And we were happy, but as you can probably spot, they say, I mean, Wisconsin is not just Wisconsin and nothing is around it. It's very convenient that the optimization says that Madison is going to be the location of the biorefinery. What if you were next to a state that also is very fertile and has bioenergy lands? So really, everybody was saying, you have to do that, but at a larger scale. That's the last part of my presentation. Before I do that, for those of you who are more interested in the optimization, here I just have the objective function, just as at a very, very high level. The objective function takes into account capital costs here. And then we use a stochastic programming approach where we say, okay, the capital costs are going to be always there, always the same. These facilities are going to be there for multiple years. But now the operation every year could potentially be different because the weather is going to be different, right? And productivity in the fields is going to be different. So for the operational decisions, let's say the annual plan, we introduce scenarios to represent different years, representative years. So this is, let's say, the probability of a scenario of a year occurring. And for that year, then we have land costs, production cost of the refinery, inventory cost, transportation, environmental. We can play with this number. And then we have the option of selling bioproducts. For example, if we install a biorefinery that microbially converts biomass to ethanol, there is some excess electricity that can be produced. We want to get the product, the revenue from that byproduct. So this is at a very high level, the objective function. And then I think I'll be happy to come back to discuss the decisions. Okay.
So question about the complexity of doing
Yes.
this optimization. Are you focusing more on like a Gaussian distribution of the like yield parameters, which is more mathematically tractable, or should we be thinking Monte Carlo, like future climate scenarios out of like a very nasty distribution?
Yeah. So for this work, what we did, we actually used the as representative years, the previous 10 years.
Okay.
So we made an assumption and we said, okay, over the next 2 years, we're going to see the same weather, big assumption. And we used the simulations that our collaborators had performed for known weathers,
Right.
let's say. So this summation over us here is over 10 scenarios.
Okay, so Monte Carlo is pretty tractable when you have 10. And how nasty does it get when you get 1,000?
So it's not because it's very large, it's geographically distributed, right?
Yeah.
And we want to optimize at the same time. So it's not that we have made the design and then we run Monte Carlos, right? We say, given that these are the 10 possible realizations, what's the optimal design? So all these 10 should be taken into account at the same time when we make the design. So it's two-stage stochastic programming, the methodology that we're using. And we try to come up with the first stage decisions, investments, and operational decisions at the same time. So it's still kind of big computationally very challenging.
And I'm trying to understand when this family becomes infeasible. So like if you do global scale analysis across 1,000 climate scenarios, is it even feasible at that point?
No.
Or should we,
okay, so it
limits of this?
Yeah, it gets, so I will be showing in the next case study that I will be showing. And then I'll describe, since if there is interest in this, what we are trying to do now. In the next case study, that is now 8 states, we couldn't do stochastic.
Got it. Thank you.
We are currently trying to do that, but yeah. So let me close with this paper and kind of case study is the same kind of set of questions, but now we have expanded to 8 states, and we try to use high quality data for most of the parameters that go into the model. So this is the yields that we used, again, identified, the lands identified by the collaborators, and then the data in terms of yield and soil sequestration calculated from our collaborators, more than 56,000 fields. So we had to make some assumptions. For example, assume linear response to fertilization. It's not linear. There is a saturation point. The more we fertilize, at some point, we are not going to be getting more benefit. And we assume we dropped the stochastic part. So this is the potential for sequestration. This is the potential productivity, right? I say potential because we don't know if we are going to establish their bioenergy crops. The optimization will tell us. This is the potential locations of depots. These are the small blue triangles and biorefinery and sequestration sites. Sorry, biorefineries. I'm sorry, biorefineries. Green are potential sequestration sites. All of these locations were identified using criteria from published reports. Okay, so for example, for a depot, there has to be a train station, so a biorefinery should be so close to a urban area, and many different scenarios. For the sequestration sites, again, this is taken from DOE, and we are using the location and also the cost. The DOE reports also have the cost for sequestering at these sites. I guess it depends on the geological formation and how much pressure you have to apply. So this is still the input. And then for each potential biorefinery, we pre-calculated what would be the transportation and sequestration cost. And then finally, the information that we had to include was about the electricity grid, because electricity can be replaced in some cases or used if, for example, we choose to do a lot of CO2 sequestration at the biorefinery. The energy that we produce at the biorefinery is not sufficient. We have to import, let's say, electricity. Actually, and this turns out to be quite important. So the other data that we use is electricity price per state and emissions. So, okay, all this goes into the model, and this would be the result. Now, before I continue, I'll say, of course, no one is going to build this. Okay, so the goal of this analysis is really to understand what would be the impact, both environmental and economic, if we could approach the optimal configuration. Because again, here we're solving an optimization model. There is no single decision maker. So again, we're not saying that this is how, if bioeconomy were to take off, that's how it would look like. Absolutely not. It's more to understand which are good targets. Okay, so let me walk through this figure, which again has a lot of information. So here we're assuming that the social cost of carbon is zero. What we mean by that is that we do not value the carbon, for example, that would be emitted at a harvesting site. We do not value the carbon that would be emitted during transportation, right? We value only the carbon for which we would get credit with the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is the configuration we get. Now, orange fields represent fertilized fields. We see almost no green, so we do not establish if we're not going to fertilize, and then the black dots are fields that are not being established. So this is in terms of land and management options. Then the small blue triangles represent installation of depots. These, as expected, are far away from biorefineries. So there is a little bit of green here, if you can see. So then for these essentially are very high quality lands. We would like to use it. They don't even require fertilization, but then they are too far away from the biorefinery. So then we have to densify them in these depots and then ship them back to these two refineries. The refineries are the blocks, and then the outline signifies the technology. So we use pyrolysis with hydrogen purchase. And these are the two main metrics, cost contributions and emissions, with the black triangle giving the final value. So in terms of cost, we see that using Inflation Reduction Act numbers, we get this significant credit for sequestering CO2, and that's what lowers the price. Again, using NREL assumptions for all these technologies, gasification, pyrolysis, and microbial fermentation. And these are the emissions. And what is interesting here, the majority comes from CCS, a smaller portion, still significant portion, comes from soil sequestration. Now, if we repeat the analysis, but we say, well, we should be also thinking about the real CO2 emissions that are not accounted in the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, this would be emissions due to harvesting or transportation. And we get a credit for avoiding this type of emissions. Then the configuration will be quite different. So we will see that we have many more depots. We go to better lands, let's say, to establish biomass, where we are going to have more sequestration. And we also use different technologies. And this is kind of if we overlay the yield and the quality of the grid that we are replacing. So the technology selection at the end kind of depends on what electricity we are displacing. If we are displacing, we will not be selling electricity in a location where the grid is relatively renewable. Almost final slide. This is, you have seen this type of heat map. Every point in this heat map is a result of an optimization as we change the demand and the sequestration credit. So as the sequestration credit increases, we start picking different technologies, which is not surprising. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip this. So to conclude, I hope I was able to convince you, at least partially, that systems engineering offers this system-wide view and help us think about these new technologies. And I would say the immediate benefit is these methods allow us to assess these new technologies and identify the major drivers. And this is kind of very useful for collaborators who are doing fundamental research in some of these technologies, but also allow us to understand the system. For the large-scale system that I showed, I would maybe these are the takeaway messages. First one is that really carbon capture is a non-trivial question because every platform comes with multiple options. It appears that gasification to hydrogen is the best option. The answer is location specific and time dependent. It will change as the grid changes. And then what I presented towards the end, accounting for carbon is critical when we're thinking about this network. And bioenergy, oops, here I'm missing something. Bioenergy is reasonable under certain incentives. It requires new methods. Going back to the question, right now, I would say that we can solve these models like for an 8-state region deterministically. We are currently working towards a nationwide model, and we have developed some methods that would allow us to solve it deterministically. So we can expand the geographic region to all the states, although one would say, wow, this model would be much, much bigger. It's not, because the availability of these lands is concentrated in the Midwest. So we expect the size of the model to double, although the model would account for the entire country. And then there are, I would say, the two things that we would like to include or they remain open is, can we account for uncertainty while we are doing nationwide modeling? And can we develop models that we take into account the temporal aspects of these systems, right? As the climate changes, these yields and soil sequestrations will change. So how do we account for that? Of course, uncertainty, especially when we're talking about climate, is not so easy to model, and we have deep uncertainty. So I think I'll stop here. So we have some time for questions. Thank you again for the invitation and for joining.
Well, thank you very much. This is fascinating. Let me ask you one question about the translation of the stuff to practice. So the biomass, for example, you're focusing on sweetgrass and marginal lands. What's the complexity of expanding it to agricultural residue, forest residue, thinking invasive species? There's plenty of places where invasive species are coming in. They become free, self-growing, source of material. But they're harvested in different schedules. They're affected by weather and very differently. How does that complicate your analysis?
Yeah. Very good question. So in the model in principle can be expanded, right? It would be different fields with different parameters that would go into the model. All of this, and then I'm learning, I can pretend that I know a little bit more than I really do because of our collaborators. So I think what goes into it's irrigation, it's fertilization, it's tillage, it's cover crops. There are many, many decisions that can be made at the land level, type of land, type of crop, right? All of this, that though, are accounted for in these process simulations in the Basel lab. So they could generate inputs for us by taking into account all these details. How exactly, what is the management in these fields? Mm-hmm. What these process, they are called process models, what these process models generate, we are almost agnostic to how this was generated. As long as our models, the supply chain, let's say, model, has this input, we can rerun it.
Right. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Other questions?
Well, I think for me, it's also would be so you focus on bioenergy, but there's many other ways of using biomass that I'm thinking reduce the uncertainty in the design of a plant, like the financial feasibility of a plant. For example, if you have a pyrolysis plant, you can produce biochars at different temperatures of the same plant, but biochar solids, bio oils that can become biofuels later, or biogas, which has methane and hydrogen. And depending on the market conditions, you can theoretically switch things around.
Yeah.
And I didn't get a sense of this time varying switching behavior in this analysis, but I want to see like to what extent that matters, to what extent multiple outputs can be produced from roughly the same installed infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, you are identifying all the things that we are working on. So what I would say for the study that we presented, and actually there was a lot of back and forth, we really wanted to use whatever is in NREL reports, right?
Mhm.
Because hardwoods for pyrolysis, no softwoods. Is it consistent? We do switchgrass for this. So we said, okay, we're just going to use whatever is available and well established. We are currently trying to understand what we would do. Yeah, biomethane, I think, is a very good example. We are doing the analysis, and it turns out, I think, that biomethane is probably the best option.
Okay.
Instead of bioelectricity, let's say. Because of the credits, because of as electricity is becoming more renewable, the mitigation that we achieve is lower. But this is still at a local level. So we're doing the analysis at a biorefinery. Let's say, what's the best strategy to employ at a biorefinery? Produce electricity, produce biomethane, produce liquid fuel. I mean, there are all these different options, right? And as we have seen, probably the answer will change if we now locate it in a specific part.
Right.
And the way, I mean, it took some time to really understand what's going on is certain technologies benefit differently from economies of scale. So technologies that benefit more from economies of scale, they are very good options in high productivity areas because we don't have to go too far away to get that biomass. Whereas technologies that do not scale well are, yeah.
And mobile technologies that go to the materials. So actually, on that front, how does this analysis change if we go to Africa or Brazil? The data is much lower, the density of agriculture is lower or more sporadic. Yeah, how do you deal with that?
Probably, I mean, again, what I would say that maybe the model can be readily used, but since what would be available would be less and more expensive, we would see a heat map that is probably significantly more expensive.
Right.
Yeah,
it's good to understand. So yeah, no, thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk and I think valuable for us all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Greg.